The D&D multiverse is vast. There are the core realms of the material plane, the homebrew realms and worlds within demiplanes. We have the outlying planes of Nightmare and Dream, the planes that touch our own like the Shadowfell and Feywild, and many others between these two extremes. The D&D multiverse is secret. Dungeons and crypts lie scattered beneath ancient deserts and treacherous mountains. Insidious knowledge lies within dusty libraries and in the rotted fingers of long-dead mages. Madness leeches from the minds of creatures of darkness and horror. Secrets, knowledge, and madness that could rise up when events align, when the timing is both perfect and terrible. The D&D multiverse is threat. Hundreds of monsters, catalogued by sages and keepers of the Mortifera, each designed uniquely to cruelly slaughter the few protectors of the civilized world. Ancient and forgotten overlords of tyrannous or nihilistic civilizations converge upon our world, hundreds or even thousands lurking beneath us, among us, or without, above us, in the silent gaps between the stars of the serene night sky. But we control forces which keep these threats at bay, at least until the next sunset. A sharp piece of work steel in the gut will work for a time. A sharpened stick flying through the air can fell even the strongest demon if fired from capable hands, but steel will rust, and it's not like sticks grow on trees. The multiverse gives us another gift to harness, with which we can either become the darkness that would consume us, or hold it back indefinitely. Magic. Hello everyone, my name is not actually Red No Blue, but it works just as well as any other name. This is the first video in what will hopefully be many, dedicated to the study of magic, casters, spells, and items. But what is magic? We've been taught that the firebolt we cast to strike down the goblin, that is magic, but it is not. It is the consequence of magic. It is magical. It is as magical as the Holy Avenger Sword, or the Staff of the Magi, or Mordenkainen, or Xanathar, but it is not absolute magic. But while mages and spells and items have their lore, magic itself as a property of the D&D multiverse has little to explain it. Functionally, magic is the medium by which spells are possible, but the focus is on what you can cast. But why do we need components beyond the mechanism of the game imposing these limitations? We have lore about the powerful mage casting the fireball. We have lore about the fireball spell itself, but there's a moment when the bead travels along a straight line to its destination, a space, a gap between the caster and the effect. Where is that gap's lore? When I created the homebrew game world in 3rd and 4th edition, I saw that there were different categories of spells. Mages cast arcane magic, clerics were divine, druids were primal. In my mind, I had the idea that these were different sources of energy and were part of the mortal arsenal. Perhaps then the monsters wielded different energies. Elemental energy could be its own source of power. Angels could wield supernal. Devils had their contracts, so contractual magic had to exist. Some creatures existed outside of time, and so must wield chronotic or time energy. The end result was there were 13 types of magic. I made up these interactions and types of magic because I believe that a mage wielded a completely different energy to a cleric or a druid, but there are always holes. A bard can cast healing spells but is an arcane caster. Clerics of nature gods still wield divine sources of power but can copy what druids do. I had to dig deeper into the lore of magic. It wasn't much of a surprise that I was wrong, and I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to dedicate my time to teaching you about magic from 5th edition and older, the philosophies and lessons of magic from previous editions, yes, even 4th, can give us greater insight into the 5th age of magic. We can talk about how to use current spells, the histories of magical items and places, and the greatest mages and hierophants. We can invent new spells together, talk about the magical ability of monsters, or without stepping on the toes of certain other godlike YouTubers. We can work to rid the universe of threat, so that our characters will live to see the next dawn, and all the dawns after. but first we need to understand magic. The weave, the fabric of miracle and destruction. In the IRL scientific world, we understand that the universe functions due to rules. Gravity, light speed, the strong and weak nuclear forces, these and many more rules exist and form the basis of reality. In the fantasy world where magic exists, there must also be laws governing the use of that magic. From an outside perspective, the D&D game is built on rules, so it's easy to assume that the game fiction acknowledges rules also. As above, so below. An understanding of these rules is necessary to develop and use spells, at least in-game. Yet the rulebooks are lacking the explanation and breakdown of these rules, opting instead for a "it works, but we don't know how it works" approach. Move your hands like this, speak the words like that, throw the guano in the air and make a fireball that burns all of your enemies. Oh, and your fighter. Why was the fighter standing there? Anyway. In the modern world, we're used to the idea of particles being energy and energy permeating the universe, passing through and connecting all matter and all the spaces between matter. A cohesive energy field that flows through every point in the multiverse, penetrating all magic, forming a link between all people and things, all events and places. Could this principle be used in the magical universe? It turns out a few people back in the mid to late 80s certainly thought so. Some of the ancients who considered the elements to be air, earth, fire, and water also believed in the fifth element they called Akasa. Akasa is defined thus: the celestial aether, or astral light, that occupies all space, the cosmic spirit substance, the vast reservoir of being. This fifth element, this Akasa, could be taken as the energy field which permeates the multiverse. There's no origin for it because it's always been there. There's no source because it's infinite. The ubiquity of magic is probably why there's not much in the way of lore, in much the same way that there's not much in the way of lore for breathable air. Because it's everywhere, and is the unspoken mechanism by which spells manifest and magical items are powered. People haven't had to wonder how it was created, how it's perpetually generated, and where it comes from. It just is. The Akasa can be collected and shaped and locked into distinct patterns. The pattern can be really simple or really complicated. The collected Akasa is stronger and more energetic than the background field, and that's when it manifests in the material world. Throw a rapidly spinning Celtic knot in a goblin, and on the material plane, a small bolt of fire impacts against it. Just like sound, the effect can only travel along the medium of magic. You can't teleport into an anti-magic zone, for example. Going back to the original request for gap lore, the Akasa is collected and burns energetically as it is imposed upon the material plane, but is locked inside a tiny bead. That bead of concentrated energy moves away from the caster, travelling in the same medium as it's composed of. Think of it like ice floating upon water. At a predetermined destination, the bead is no longer contained and rushes out in all directions until it reaches a point at which it is dispersed into the same level of medium all around it. What we see on the material plane is a 20-foot radius ball of fire. It doesn't reach past that limit because the Akasa has dissipated. It can no longer manifest. The Akasa can be consciously manipulated into distinct and known patterns, but a person's ability to manipulate it depends on their mental strength. Those with strong minds can do so much more than people who are weak-minded. In many ways it affects the material world or material people, and the more complex the weave of Akasa is, the harder it is for a material being to resist the effects. In game rules, this is the DC of the spell, affected by the spellcasting modifier of the caster. You can create a stupid wizard if you want, but the resulting fireball will be easier to dodge. But Akasa is still Akasa, and the fire will burn just as hot. Of course, mental strength alone is not sufficient to manipulate the Akasa. One must also know how to perform the manipulations. Akasa exists within the mage and in the world, and each distinct effect that they can create is a recipe. Like we said above, put your hands here, speak these exact words, and the Akasa gets collected into a certain pattern that will always do the same thing. really simple spells like Prestidigitation, or really complicated multi-layered things like Time Stop. Wizards cast spells because they've undertaken the immense study required to understand how exactly to weave a spell themselves. They need intelligence to remember. Clerics and paladins have a deity to guide their motions of weaving, or outright take over and complete the weaving themselves. They need wisdom and the strength of will to not get burned out channeling such a strong force. Druids and rangers are inspired by the natural forces, and use the wisdom and perception to mimic the patterns found in nature. Bards use the power of story and song to enact spells. Warlocks use their sense of self-worth to convince their patrons to lend a bit more of their power. And sorcerers take a huge piece of Akasa and are strong enough in their conviction to know that there's a weave of Akasa somewhere in there that will do what they want. When Gary Gygax was first designing D&D, there were a lot of questions surrounding what magic system they'd be using. Gygax's previous system, Chainmail, had an incredibly simplistic magic system that wouldn't work well for this new game, so Gygax went to other literary works to see what type of magical spellcasting systems were out there that could be used for D&D. He found 4 main types of spellcasting from fiction. Those systems which require long conjuration with much paraphernalia as a supplemental focus, those that use the short spoken spell, the ultra-powerful magic that doesn't always work precisely as it should, and the generally weak and ineffectual magic, his words, of J.R.R. Tolkien's work. Gygax knew that the system of magic would be one of the most appealing aspects of the game, and given the system it could not be time-consuming if it was to be enjoyable, nor could it be too weak or too powerful compared to martial characters, if magic users were to become a class of player character. The decision was therefore made for spells in D&D to work from a Vancian system, with 4 basic parts to spellcasting: the verbal or uttered component, the physical or somatic component, the psychic or mental aptitude needed to cast the spell, the material components by which to complete the spell. Because Gygax borrowed from Jack Vance and coined the Vancian magic that D&D uses to this day, the laws of Vance's magic should be considered canon. The rules are: magical effects are packaged into distinct spells. Each spell has one fixed purpose. A spell that throws a ball of fire at an enemy just throws balls of fire, and generally cannot be turned down to light a cigarette, for instance. Spells represent a kind of magic bomb, which must be prepared in advance of actual use, and each prepared spell can be used only once before needing to be prepared again. That's why it is also known as fire and forget magic. Magicians have a finite capacity of prepared spells, which is the de facto measure of their skill or power as magicians. A wizard using magic for combat is thus something like a living gun. They must be loaded with spells beforehand and can run out of magical ammunition. There are many spells that have been forgotten. The material components are generally consumed by the spell, and the energy becomes one with the Akasa and helps bridge the gap between the energy and the material. Some components aren't used up, but act as a focus of the energies, able to direct magic through intent, focusing the mind. They need to be strong to not be consumed, and strong materials are not usually cheap. Magic follows 3 rules concerning material components: sympathy, contagion, and signature. Sympathy states that like affects like. Start a small fire in front of you to create a massive fire somewhere else. Contagion states once together, always together. Curse a doll made with a bit of someone's hair, and the person is cursed also. Signature states that spells draw directly from the nature of their components. Jump uses a grasshopper leg. Grease uses animal fat or butter. Ultimately, the laws of magic are dependent on the DM and the campaign world, but it is important that we start here. Everything relies on how magic works, but now that we've gone over the basics, it's time to move on. Coming up next, we're going to start talking about a little bit of a challenge that one of my friends has given me. They requested
I want you to tell me all the ways I can get from point A to point B in Dungeons & Dragons.